Hi, everyone. Want to begin by thanking the organizers of the symposium and my co-symposiasts. Um, in the spirit of collegiality and friendship, I'm referring to everyone by first name. So, hi to Robert, Lara, Furbod, and of course, Amir. Special thanks to you, Amir, for writing an important work that raises a serious issue that contemporary Islamic thinkers, I think, haven't really discussed much in philosophy of religion. The core issue that I think you kind of bring to the fore is the conflict or tension between, I guess, what we can call, for lack of a better phrase, Islamic morality and modern moral sensibilities. That's really, the key issue. So, in my contribution to the symposium, what I want to do is focus on the sixth and final chapter of the book, where Amir proposes a solution to the problem of divinely prescribed evil. The problem is introduced early in the book. I know that Robert had mentioned it, but just very quickly, this is from page 23 in the book. The problem arises because there's a tension between three claims that Emir describes as follows. So, number one, divinity of Scripture. Scripture is the words, he says, of an omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent God. Okay. Number two, the existence of seemingly prescribed evil. There are some actions prescribed or permitted by the best interpretation of a scriptural passage which seem immoral according to our independent moral judgments. And then thirdly, number three, reliability of our independent moral judgments. Our independent moral judgments reliably represent moral values, moral duties, and moral permissions. How can you coherently hold all three, right? I mean, this is going to be an issue for believers, and Amir is focusing on reflective Muslims. That's the problem. In chapter six, Amir offers the second of two ethics first solutions discussed in the book. So here's just the relevant quote from page 206. According to the second solution, the problem arises only if we have a moral interpretation of scriptural injunctions and can be removed once we reject that interpretation in favor of a legal interpretation of scriptural injunctions. End quote. So, to resolve the tension between the reliability of independent moral judgments and the existence of seemingly prescribed evils, Amir argues that we should adopt legal interpretation. So, this is, all happening in chapter 6. On page 208, he writes, quote, legal interpretation, actions prescribed or permitted by the best interpretation of a scriptural passage are legally obligatory or permitted according to religious law. But God or the prophet may legislate legal obligations or permissions that deviate from moral ones. End quote. Now, Amir's discussion is very rich and nuanced, and I can't do it justice in the limited time I have here, but I just want to draw your attention to a few points that I'll use and weave into my hopefully constructive feedback on the book. So, in no particular order, in this chapter, Amir explains that God's issuing of legal prescriptions can be just if God has sufficient reason to issue the prescriptions. I want to flag that as a point to come back to when I raise some concerns in a little bit. Legal permissions and obligations are designed to solve the social problems of a community, right? This is on page 209. Also on page 209, legal permissions and obligations can change over time. Those specified in morally controversial passages need not apply today. Okay. In the discussion of legal interpretation, Emir refers to the classical philosophical tale of Hayy bin Yaqdan by Ibn Tufayl. Now, on his interpretation of the story, and I do think you can interpret it more than one way, Emir infers two conclusions, and so these are stated on page 213. The social function of religious laws. The function of religious laws in a non ideal society is to solve the social problems of the community. And the permissibility of immoral laws. The best laws to solve the social problems of a community consisting of corrupt people are not necessarily correct moral principles. Okay. And then he says on page 213, Ibn Tufail's real insight lies in the understanding that religious laws, in their capacity as legal laws, can't function as the guiding principles for ideal conditions. Instead, they are the laws that serve in non-ideal conditions, or sorry, circumstances, to make communal life possible. In the story of Hayy bin Yaqdan, Amir says that the early Islamic society that existed during the time of the Prophet is comparable to the society on Upsal's island. So again, I'm assuming people know the story. If you don't know the story, it's a wonderful story worth checking out in your own time. I'm just going to have to operate on the assumption that you know what the story is about. And actually, in the book, Amir does a nice job of giving you a summary of what happens in the tale. So he says on page 219, the tale of Hayban Yakdan teaches us about the social function of religious laws. In a society where religious laws are the governing laws, scripture plays a legal role in solving the social problems of the society. And then the point is made that this was the case during the time of the prophet. And then, appealing to Scott Shapiro's conception of the planning conception of law, Amir says, scriptural injunctions reveal the social planning of the prophet to solve the social problems of the newly formed Islamic community. Similar to any new society, the newly formed Islamic society had many social problems, including issues concerning property, trade, the resolution of disputes, and so on. Scriptural injunctions specify the plan adopted by the Islamic community to address those problems, problems that were complex and contentious and involved arbitrary elements. End quote. The prophet, he notes, used moral language to express his plan to solve society's problems. Now, the moral terms, he says, don't indicate necessarily that the moral interpretation is correct. The legal interpretation is consistent with the moral language of Scripture. Another point that Amir makes, and this is on page 220, the rationality of planning includes the planner making feasible plans, which means it can sometimes be rational to legislate non optimal moral rules. Here, we've heard this before. There's the example of the Geneva Conventions. They work even though there are ethical problems with them. And then Amir says, quote, the tale of Hay is another example in which legislating the correct moral principles is irrational, end quote. One more. The lesson we learn from the tale of Hay is that there could be reasons to maintain the permissibility of immoral laws. Sometimes the best way to solve the social problems of a corrupt community is through legislating morally incorrect principles, end quote. One final quote, just so we're all kind of on the same page with the solution I want to talk about, and then I'll move to a couple of concerns I have. On page 221, Amir gives a nice summary of legal interpretation and his case for it. So he says here, quote, let me state the argument for legal interpretation. At the time of Revelation, scriptural injunctions were the laws of the society. Therefore, given the planning conception of law, they represent the prophet's planning to solve the social problems of the society. The feasibility constraint on social planning makes it the case that, in some circumstances, it is rationally necessary to legislate immoral laws to solve social problems. Assuming the Medinan community is such a case, the prophet would, in principle, or be in principle justified to legislate non optimal moral laws through scripture to solve their social problems. Therefore, legal interpretation is true, he says. That is, while actions prescribed or permitted by the best interpretation of a scriptural passage are legally obligatory or permitted, according to religious law, they may not be morally obligatory or permitted. End quote. Now, in the time that I have left, and I do hope to actually go into more detail when I put these ideas to print in due course for Agathios, fingers crossed on that. I want to confine my concerns to two. These are my two concerns I have, again, with the legal interpretation response. Concern one, I've just put under the heading of Upsal's Island and the human condition. So in Ibn Tufayl's story, Hay's island is ideal, and Upsal's island is non-ideal, a point that Amir notes on page 2 and 3. Upsal's island is basically representing Islamic society during the time of the Prophet. Okay. But now here's my, I guess, friendly pushback. Why think the island just represents the early Muslim community? Maybe the island represents the entire Muslim community, including people today. Maybe it's about the Ummah at large, or maybe even human society in general. So there is that quote, right, Amir, you have in the book. I'll just read the quote from the tale. Quote, Hay now understood the human condition. He saw that most men are no better than unreasoning animals. End quote. The way I've always read the tale is that this is a remark about the human condition in general. It's not necessarily about 7th century Arabia. Now, if that's true, if we're all on Upsal's island, so to speak, religious authorities may argue that we actually need to keep all the religious prescriptions that were implemented in 7th century Arabia. I'm not saying that I agree with that, but I'm concerned that this point can be, highlighted. As a matter of fact, to strengthen the point, one might ask whether any society is actually ideal. Is there any society where all the inhabitants are like Hayy bin Yaqdan himself? Can there even be such a society? Interestingly, note that the word utopia, like on one reading of the word from the Greek, literally means no place. Often people refer to utopia as, well, this is sort of an ideal, but I find it interesting that another reading of the Greek literally means no place. So the double meaning suggests that while utopia represents an ideal society, it's also fictional and impractical. Some thinkers in the Islamic tradition, I'm thinking here of people like Sayyid Qutb, have argued that modern society is actually in a state of jahiliyyah or ignorance, much like pre Islamic Arabia. So the argument is actually we're not better off now. Some think we're actually in a worse state now. And so we need more legislation, not less, right? This is what people have said. Now, for further considerations on, I guess, what I'm kind of zeroing in on, on human nature and religious law, I wanted to briefly talk about the arguments of the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky, in the Brothers Karamazov, because I think there's a connection you can draw with Ibn Tufail's story. Because my time is limited, I'll touch on just three issues. Number one, human capacity for moral and religious truth. In the Brothers Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor argues that people are fundamentally weak. They're unable to bear the burden of true freedom and moral responsibility. He tells Christ that the church has taken on the responsibility of guiding people through authority, miracle, and mystery because they're incapable of following Christ's true teachings on their own. Now, in Ibn Tufail's story, we have the idea that most people are no better than unreasoning animals. They're incapable of understanding philosophical and theological truths. When Hay tries to teach the people on Upsal's island the ultimate truth, they reject it and they become more resistant to wisdom. Okay, so I thought that was kind of an interesting comparison. Number two, the role of religious law. The Grand Inquisitor asserts that religious laws are pragmatic. They're a necessity rather than an expression of divine truth. The church enforces strict rules to keep people in check, sacrificing truth for stability. Ibn Tufail, in the story, argues that religious laws in non ideal societies serve a social function rather than a strictly moral one. The laws on Upsal's island are meant to regulate behavior and maintain social harmony, not necessarily to lead people to philosophical truth, right? So that's point number two. And then thirdly, the consequences of revealing truth. The Grand Inquisitor claims that if Christ's true teachings were imposed on the masses, you would get chaos, suffering, despair, because people need authority more than truth. Ibn Tufail kind of, I think, demonstrates that idea through Hay's failed attempt to teach the people on Upsal's island. Instead of enlightening them, the teachings cause confusion and resistance. Ultimately, he concludes that most people should follow the religious tradition over philosophical truth. Now, here's the point that I want to make. I'm concerned that the Ibn Tufail style argument may lend itself to support the Grand Inquisitor's view, which is a bit more dark, right? I think Ibn Tufail has maybe a more optimistic view. The Grand Inquisitor view is a little bit more pessimistic. Why would there be this lending to the argument? Well, because of the shared point that most people are incapable of handling higher truth and need religious law to guide them. Of course, there are differences in the stories, but both works talk about the limitations of humans. And so the limitations are such that one might argue that actually we're all on the island. We're all on Upsal's island. And so even if they include immoral elements, religious laws, again, people might argue, some, are practically necessary for maintaining order in a flawed society. And this point may be taken seriously by oppressive regimes where human rights are violated. So this is my first concern, right? I think, how do we block that move? I think that we need to kind of address this. And it involves getting into concerns about, I guess, human nature. Second issue I have, like again, speaking very broadly, I do think the problem of divinely prescribed evil still lurks. So recall that I noted early on that, for Amir, God's issuing of legal prescriptions can be just if God has sufficient reasons to issue the prescriptions. Now, in the formulation of the problem, God's omni properties are explicitly stated in the book. Here, one might argue that a being that's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent cannot have the any sort of sufficient reason. You see, so God here is, just for short, I'll say God is omni-God. God has all the omni properties of omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, omnipresence, all the omni properties. So if that's the case, one can say, look, even if divine laws serve a legal function, why would omni-God legislate laws that include morally problematic elements? One could argue that legally pragmatic laws should still align with correct morality for God. Why would God issue laws that allow slavery, gender equality, inequality, corporal punishment, or even temporarily? Surely God would find a way to solve societal problems without using immoral means. I don't know, Amir, if this is a helpful analogy, right? I'm not sure. I'm still thinking about this. Sometimes when I talk about the problem of evil in my philosophy classes, students will say that God may allow, or God might even cause, earthquakes and tsunamis for population control. Population control is important. One way to ensure we've got population control is to have earthquakes and tsunamis, they say. Or they'll say that God can alleviate problems caused by resource scarcity where there's not enough food for everyone, say, again, through an earthquake or a tsunami. Now, the obvious response here, of course, is to say, well, why would Omni God need to do it this way? Here's one quote that I put up in the materials I have on the problem of evil when I talk about this. This is from Voltaire, of course, famous attack on optimism. His poem on the Lisbon disaster, where he says, quote, "Are you so sure that the great eternal cause, the creator and knower of all things, could not have thrown us into this miserable world without forming volcanoes seething under our feet? Do you set this limit for the supreme power? Would you forbid him from exercising mercy? Doesn't the eternal craftsman have infinite means available for his handiwork?" End quote. Now, a fair question, I think, from Voltaire. One can ask a similar question about God and God's planning for fixing societal problems. Now, I know in the book there is sort of an objection or a reply to the objection, the feasibility constraint on divine law. So one might say, well, God's legal commands are constrained by social feasibility at the time of revelation, to which one could say, right, but in what sense does social feasibility constrain divine omnipotence? Maybe it does, but I do think that point requires further discussion. So, just to bring my threads together now, my second worry about the legal interpretation approach has to do with the absence of a substantive defense as to why omni-God legislates laws that include morally problematic elements. Um, that's it. That's my second worry. So I'll go ahead and stop now. Thank you.